Ta-da! Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. This is Pastor Megan Rohr, and I am coming to you from San Francisco here at Grace Evangelical Lutheran Church at 32nd, 33rd-ish, and Ulloa. And we have Pastor Amanda.
Hello, I am Pastor Amanda Zenzalo. I currently serve at Central Lutheran Church in downtown Portland, Oregon. We are on the corner of 21st and Schuyler, and our services are at 10:15 on Sunday mornings with education at 9 a.m. All are welcome.
And joining us for the first time here at Bible Study That Doesn't Suck is John. John, will you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is John Longworth. I'm the pastor of Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Rutland, Vermont, and also the Little Lamb School.
Lutherans, yay. That's my cheer. So I thought maybe we could start with the Isaiah text. For those who haven't seen this before, we follow the lectionary, which is the passages that go in a 3-year cycle that were a long time ago chosen by a bunch of white men who thought that these were the things we should talk about in church. And faithfully, many congregations still follow them. You'll find them at our congregation this Sunday. So yeah, most congregations probably will hear these texts. We haven't just picked them randomly out of the air, because these probably aren't the ones we'd have picked randomly out of the air if we were to do that. So the Isaiah text, remember, Isaiah is a text that has a rhythm of complaining that God's justice hasn't been achieved yet, and pushing and goading and maybe heckling God a little bit to try to encourage that justice to happen. And then there's also a coming back to this idea that God is bigger than us, and even when we're mad that God isn't doing all of the things that God has promised, like end hunger and poverty, that God is still our God and is bigger than us, and there's not a lot we can do about it. And so there's some of that in the book of Isaiah. One of the cool things that's unique about this text for this Sunday that I really like, if you look at verse 7, this idea of there being a shroud that's cast over all people. This is probably talking about a mourning shroud, the people who are mourning the loss of people that they love due to injustice and through war and famine and illnesses and stuff like that Isaiah has been really mad about through the previous 24 verses. This text talks about that shroud, or that big cloth that is spread out over all the nations, being removed and swallowed up from death. And because I love Mark a lot, I like when there is a text in Isaiah that illuminates something that we'll find in the Gospel of Mark. If you remember that part in the end of chapter 15 of Mark, early bits of chapter 16, where Jesus dies on the cross, there's a huge earthquake, and there's this cloth in the temple, the holiest of holy place, the place where God's finger touches the earth that keeps the chaos still. When Jesus dies, that cloth that traditionally would have the pictures of the 12 nations rips in two. And so when that happens during the death of Jesus, if you were a super geeky faithful person, you would be reminded of this text from Isaiah 25. You would see that shroud of the nations being torn in two, this promise that all people are going to be reconciled, that peace and justice will reign forever, and that God is going to wipe away the tears of the faces. And so it's no coincidence that this verse 9 from this section that we have are the very words that the centurion also quotes when Jesus dies. The temple is, the curtain is torn in two, and then someone says, surely this is the Son of God. This is the one we're waiting for that might save us. And so I just want to point out that kind of fun echoing that happens in the Gospel of Mark, because Gospel of Mark is coming soon. Yay. The other thing I wanted to point out is in the lectionary text that you'll hear on Sunday, it will be a little bit different than the text that I'm going to post down here in a second, because the lectionary text is going to end at verse 9. And it's going to sound really great, right? God saves everybody. But verse 10, I always like to point out when the very next text is like contradictory or stupid. And this is one of those Sundays, right? This is a text where it says, and God's going to save everybody, and the nations aren't going to be divided anymore, except for the Moabites, who are going to be thrown into the dung heap. right? And this is, I think, one of those times where Isaiah should have shut up, right? Because it was really great. Everyone was going to be saved. All the nations were going to be united. There was going to be peace, except for the Moabites, right? You may have been to a sermon once or twice when the pastor didn't shut up at the right moment and their sermon was perfect until they said just one more thing. None of us know anything about that as pastors. This also happens to politicians. Joe Biden has a little bit of this. He says really great things and then he says one more thing and it's like, oh, bugger, right? And so this, I think, is a great text to leave in, not because the Moabites are going to be put on a dung heap. We've since then we've come up with lots of other people that we dislike way more than the Moabites. Most of us don't even know who the Moabites are. We'd have to look it up. This is a great reminder that even when we think peace and justice is going to happen, even when we understand for a brief moment what the justice of God looks like, we screw it up by overthinking it, by thinking of a group of people that we don't like, and by saying, but except for them. And so the good news is that God's justice doesn't have a but except for them, at least in our Lutheran understanding. But sometimes when we preach about it, sometimes when we talk about it, sometimes when we watch what justice looks like on the news, and sometimes in our gospel readings. Even Jesus does this every once in a while, right? Jesus proclaims, everybody's great, the good news is for everyone. And then this lady called the Syrophoenician woman comes along, and he has this stutter moment where he has to be reminded that everybody gets to be a part of this new God's plan. So those are the things that I think are fun about this text. What do you think, John?
Well, in the Bible study that we held this afternoon over at Good Shepherd, we talked a little bit about the classic prophetic pattern of talking about something cool and then something way better than that. Right? And so I sort of like how the two halves of the text as it's presented for Isaiah are a reminder that God has protected the people from some pretty serious enemies, very, very scary enemies, world powers at the time, and said, so we had a party when they all left, and that was good, but we're going to have a way, way better party, a much better festival and feast when God does this next trick, which is never mind to defeat a particular nation or a particular empire, but to actually undo death itself. Because, I mean, if there's one thing that's makes an equal between Judea and Egypt and Assyria and everywhere, everybody dies. And if God can overthrow that, that's an event worth having a party for. Way better than a party for any kind of national victory.
I like that. What do you think, Amanda? You look like you're maybe eating something, and that we always call on you when you're chewing.
That's okay. I'm going to apologize to begin with, just to say that my day had some unexpected events in it, so I haven't had anything to eat since about 10 this morning, and it's 4 p.m., so I'm munching on my emergency stash from my desk, and I apologize. I am muting everything so people don't have to hear me munch. And I'm going to make tea in just a minute by going very far away from the camera, and then I'll be back. I was looking down at the sheet from this morning's text study as well, kind of in reference to this piece about death being still the problem, and it's going to be the one next best thing that we get to come do, kind of own and make go away. And I'll say that the text study didn't talk that much about this particular passage because the gospel is so hard this week that we kind of looked at this and said, yeah, this is some interesting stuff, but it's probably not what we're going to preach on because it's a little bit odd and it's a little bit different. I think an interesting piece for people to know, just folks who may be new to Scripture and reading Bible, is to know that this section, Isaiah chapter 24 through 27, it's a little section sometimes known as the Isaiah Apocalypse. Apocalypse doesn't mean the end of the world. It means talking about the bad things going away. Kind of at the end, when all things are said and done, God will be the winner. And so this section, our scripture, sometimes people assume that the same person wrote all the way through a book of a Bible that is attributed to their name. But Isaiah is a good example of a book in the Bible that perhaps had multiple authors. Perhaps was not authored by one person named Isaiah, but that we receive this scripture down through history and down through tradition in the way that we receive it, even though there are sections of it that seem very different than other sections. So this is from a piece within Isaiah talking about this kind of promise that eventually all things are going to work out. And I think you can see the human hand in there, that, you know, except for the people we don't like. You know, I mean, it's we are human, and human beings, we believe in the ELCA Lutheran tradition, we believe that human beings were inspired by God to write down this scripture, but we don't believe that it's inerrant. We don't believe that every single word came directly from God and was supposed to be written down. We understand that there's humanness within the writing of these things. So it makes sense that they would, I mean, just from what I know of people, that they're kind of saying, yeah, everybody's going to get, oh, except them, because they're kind of, I don't like them, so yeah, not them. You know, because that, we do that. We're human. And I think maybe some comfort can be found there, that when you want salvation for everybody but your enemies, that maybe you're not alone and that you're human and wanting that. Now we can work towards not feeling that way. But it's okay when you feel that way. You're not the first person in all of creation to want vengeance. Did that make any sense at all? Can we move on to Philippians? It's a much more exciting passage.
That made a lot of sense, and it also kind of ties into one of the coolest things about being a Lutheran, and that's all of the weird things that Luther wrote about poo. And by that I mean Luther was really great. Like, Luther wrote the best letters in condemnation of people that he didn't like. Unfortunately, some of them were words that were quoted in the Holocaust, and those we are not big fans of as Lutheran. But there's some really cool stuff that he wrote about the Pope and other people that he didn't like, and they always ended up being dog poo, or dog poo that was so horrible it was like vomited out from the dog again. And for anyone who likes a good poop or fart joke, this is maybe your part of the Bible.
You know, I just real quickly, I'm struck. Such a tiny enemy makes such a big mention that they're the ones going to end up on the dung heap.
Yeah.
But you know, it's not like this is foreign to our experience, right? When did the Cold War end? Almost 20 years ago, but we still have an embargo on Cuba.
Right. Yes.
So, you know, it's not like this is anything that we haven't done ourselves.
And if you've ever been to the zoo and visited the monkeys, you know that flinging poo is a part of creation, I guess. I guess it's just something animals do. Well, before we skip to the Philippians text, which of course would be Amanda's favorite, you'll see why later. Amanda always likes the text where the ladies get a shout out, even when they're fighting. But Exodus is...
And there's a lot of joy in that text, so, and peace that passes understanding. So it's not just Euodia and Syntyche that are really cool in there, but there's like, be positive and focus on the good stuff. There's your teaser. Okay, I'll shut up. Megan, go.
Well, Exodus is our typical whiny people saved from slavery story that you'll see anytime you skim somewhere in the book of Exodus. Now, remember, what I think is important to remember about this text is that when Moses begins to have encounters with God, God doesn't say, hey, you faithful people, you know exactly how to worship me, so I'm going to come and be a part of all that because you're so great. God comes to Moses because everyone has forgotten God. And so you would expect these to be people who have no idea what the right answers are for anything, who don't know how to worship, and are a bit ADHD about it. And so that's exactly what we find. They get saved in their Charlton Heston version where they ride in chariots and go through the sea. They find themselves delivered, meaning that the Pharaoh was killed. Maybe or maybe not that happened historically, but if it did, it would be the equivalent of the tiniest unweaponized group taking and conquering the most powerful people of their time. Great story, regardless of whether or not it's historically accurate. And so this is a moment where they're in the desert, they don't have enough food, so they get really mad and grumble. They get food, they get really mad and grumble that it's not different food every day. Then they get thirsty, so they get mad and grumble. And this one is fantastic. If you've ever been anywhere with kids and they get in trouble, this is what you can imagine those kids would say. So it starts off, Moses was gone for too long, which justifies all the bad things that they're going to get into, right? Moses went away, but it was too long. And what I think is fascinating is if you tried to convince people to give up all of their gold and their silver and put it into something in common, that would be very hard to convince people to do nowadays. They'd be like, screw you, I don't want to make a bowl, I want to make an elephant, or I want to keep my earrings. And there would be a lot of fighting. So I'm impressed that these whiny people are able to agree on something to melt down their jewelry for. But it's a very interesting story where God notices that they're misbehaving when Moses isn't looking and sends Moses back down to kind of be with these people who can't be left alone, because every time they're left alone, then they misbehave. That's kind of the crux of what's happening in this story. What I think is fun about it is if you think about the fact that right now, during this time when Jesus has resurrected and is up in the wherever Jesus hangs out place in the cosmos, and it's really hard to tell who our prophets are, because there's really loud people who are mad about everything and there's really loud people who like everything, and it's really hard to figure out what the voice of God is. There aren't obvious burning bushes, there aren't obvious pillars of cloud, there aren't like really obvious signs to be like, behold, God's stuff is happening. Or if it is, we're too dumb to notice, right? So how could God expect us to get anything right? Right? Because we don't know who to listen to. Moses has been gone a very long time. Jesus has been gone a very long time. How could we possibly be expected to get anything right? As Lutherans, we don't believe we have to get anything right, that God gets it all right and reconciles us to God instead. But if you are someone who is a little bit on the rule-following bent, this might be a great text for you to just push you a little bit in the way of you don't have to follow all the rules because God doesn't expect you to. If you're someone who doesn't like following rules and really is looking for a structured way to follow God, this might be a text that will be unhelpful for you, right? You might want something that's going to give you a rhythm to how you can celebrate and how you can worship. So that's what I have to say about that. What do you think, John?
Well, thinking about the, especially just after crossing the Red Sea, I spend a lot of time each week with preschoolers and kindergartners, and just the whole thing of Moses being away made me think of, we have these teachers' assistants that swing in to give our teachers breaks, and it's just a different classroom experience when the assistant is in charge. It's not that it's not school, and it's not that the children aren't learning, but you know when the real teacher is there, and that's what this makes me think of. I don't know. I get that in some ways the people are really trying. They want to relate to God. They even want to. They may even be asking the remaining grandmas and grandpas, the kind of the elders of the community. Well, who was that? Who just saved us? And they don't know. So they're scrambling for something, and they're like, maybe it was a giant bull that lives in the sky. That works, right? Let's make one. I think that sometimes we come down really hard on that because Moses freaks out when he sees what's going on. But I think in some ways they're just really grappling. They're looking for something to hang on to. Like, who is it that saved us? We want to see them. We want to know, who is it? What do they look like? So I think that you can actually have some fun with the text, provided you don't take it too seriously.
I like that. What do you think, Amanda?
hadn't even thought about this passage yet because we didn't talk about it this morning at all. Folks are sticking to the other part of the lectionary base. But it's an interesting passage, and the whole part about getting people to participate and actually giving up their stuff, and the searching for something to see and to know and to understand. We can make light of the Moses was gone too long, but the reality of death in the mountains was probably pretty huge. So if they were really afraid that this leader was gone, then what were they going to be able to get the people to follow anymore? I think I'm also struck, I believe that it's Aaron and Miriam who lead this to be made. And so this is Aaron and Miriam's falling. This is the brother and sister of Moses. This is the point in which they kind of fall down and make the mistake. So we can oftentimes look at people in the Bible and think that God only picks the very best and the people who can't make mistakes, and that God expects us to not make mistakes. And then we can look at someone like Aaron and Miriam who do all sorts of amazing things in partnership with Moses for the people of Israel, and they fall, they falter, they panic. Moses has been gone for too long, and what are we going to do to keep these people contained and together and working together? We're in the wilderness. Crap, how are we going to do this? And they falter. They get everything together and they build this golden calf, and it is because of this that Aaron and Miriam do not make it to the promised land. This and a couple other events that happen, but this is the beginning of their fall. Moses has Moses's own fall later on, and also does not make it to the promised land. So it's an interesting piece to look at, especially the Old Testament, that these folks were not perfect. They were not great at what they did, and sometimes they didn't get the reward that they were looking for. And I think that that's part of where the promise of Jesus comes in for Christians a little different than it comes in for Jewish folk. I could be wrong. Megan?
Yes. For those of you who are curious to read on farther, Moses is going to become a drunk, and shenanigans will follow. That's what's going to happen. Psalm 23 is one of my favorites. I'm going to post a video down here. One of my questions with Grandma, when my grandma Darlene and I were in Ireland following the St. Patrick Trail, we took a special effort to take pictures, to try to have pictures of the entire Psalm 23, and including us lying down in the pasture together, which is quite fun. Part of it was interesting because my grandmother has long had her funeral planned out, and kept it in a little drawer that she kind of only told me about because she wanted me to be the pastor at the service. And I asked my grandmother what text she had picked, and she said she hadn't really thought about it. The only thing she knew is she didn't want Psalm 23, because everyone picks Psalm 23, and she didn't want her funeral to be just like everybody's funeral. But then after we took our pictures all through Ireland, she decided she did want Psalm 23 because we had had this experience with it. And so lots of people have connections to this psalm, in part because it is at so many funerals. It's also a psalm that is quoted enough that sometimes it's the only thing that people have at least part of it memorized and can say it together. And in our congregation, it's the one time that we don't say our psalms responsively, because everyone usually wants to say Psalm 23 all together because it's kind of a fun one to say. And so I just encourage you to make your own memories with scriptural texts, and even if no one understands why you might choose a particular text as your favorite or as the one that you want at your memorial service, let your pastor know, because it could be fun. That's all. Anyone else have Psalm 23 thoughts?
Well, I was talking to the folks in the text study today about that shadow. When it talks about being in the depending on the translation, the valley of the darkest shadow or the shadow of death. And around here we've got a really easy way to relate to that image. I was visiting with a couple that has a cabin in the woods, and the gentleman there maintains a large sort of personal arboretum. And so while he was out maintaining, he said one day, just up on the rise above him, there he saw 3 coyotes slide right out of the grass, and were just sort of looming over him. And so I love that image of the shepherd who is basically equipped with nothing, right? A t-shirt, sandals, and a couple of sticks. And yet that's enough to make the author feel safe if they're with the shepherd. So you got, I don't know, coyotes, mountain lions, whatever else up on the hill, and it's okay because the shepherd's here, and the shepherd is stupid enough to go chase after the coyotes with a big stick. So that makes me feel safe. So I love the confidence, that's placed in the God figure in that psalm.
I like that. Amanda, do you have any thoughts?
There's lots of really beautiful musical settings of Psalm 23, and lots of different ways that it can be used, particularly at funerals for folks who are who want this at their funeral but don't want it to be like everybody else's. There's lots of creative ways that people have used Psalm 23 for funeral settings and those kinds of pieces. Obviously, you said funeral, so I'm going to geek out about funerals for a minute.
I think Amanda's done more funerals than any pastor on the planet.
That's not true.
A pastor living in Africa right now.
There are plenty of people who have done more funerals than I. I just have a passion for them being done well. And the thing with Psalm 23 is also looking at how psalms can travel from one into another and their import. Is to know that Psalm 22 is a lament, and it's actually, if you look at Psalm 22, it begins with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" which may sound familiar to some folks who are familiar with the crucifixion scenes. And laments, traditionally, when you look at a lament, it moves you through this kind of claim of God's absence and losing God and kind of blaming God for being gone, and then a list of all the horrible things that have happened, that God has abandoned me, and therefore all of these horrible things have happened, and a list and explanation of the ordeals that have been experienced. And then the end of a lament, a psalm of lament, will move to an affirmation of trust and a reaffirmation that God will provide. Psalm 22 doesn't actually do that. Psalm 22 kind of ends in the midst of pain. And so you're encouraged to read the next psalm, which is 23, which is a psalm of great trust, and a psalm where we hear this, I am going to trust in God. God is going to provide. So when you read laments, if the psalm does not call you back into faith and trust and right relationship with God, keep reading. Read the next psalm. Because chances are you're going to see in the next psalm that affirmation of trust happening. So it can be very interesting for folks to recognize that the psalm that is being referenced by Christ on the cross, Psalm 23 follows it immediately with this promise of, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forevermore. So a really beautiful kind of movement. Another piece of interesting note is that Psalm 23's popularity is relatively young. This psalm has not had the kind of everybody knows it popularity until the more recent centuries. We can say, well, that seems like a long time, but keeping in mind that Christian history is about 2,000 years old, for something to be popular for a couple of centuries is actually not that long in our overall Christian history. And this is a psalm that has reached a lot of popularity and received a lot of attention, particularly in the United States. And I think that it makes sense that for our experience and our piety within our culture, that Psalm 23 would be one that becomes very popular. There are plenty of other psalm texts that can be used very effectively for funerals or memorial services. And the idea of getting to choose your texts ahead of time, if you are contemplating what you want for those services, it is not morbid or weird or strange to choose your texts and your hymns for your service. It's actually a gift that you give to your families. It's your last opportunity to highlight to them your faith and what you have believed and what has brought you comfort, it's your opportunity to give them a message of hope. And a message of faith. So I encourage you to make an appointment with your pastor, make an appointment with someone whom you trust, and say, I'd like to think about what kind of message I want to leave for my funeral service. And that can change year after year. You do not have to keep it the same. You can update it every day that you are alive. But having that information somewhere for your family and for your loved ones is a really, really important gift. As a pastor preaching, it is always very powerful to look into the eyes of those that the deceased loved and say, this person chose this for you to hear today. And they want you to hear this message today and to share that with them. It's powerful and it's good. So don't be afraid of doing that. Our culture doesn't like to talk about death, so it can feel a little weird if you're not used to it. But just a spoiler, everybody's going to die. So you may as well do a little bit of planning and gifting to your family. That's all.
That's not all, because we're moving to Philippians, and Amanda's got something to say about that. I guess I'll just say something very briefly that I like about this text is, as I kind of spoilered earlier, is a text that mentions 2 women by name. And the lovely thing about this is it's one of the rare times when women get to have names in Scripture. And what I think is fantastic is if you've ever been new to a community, or you have felt like you're begrudgingly a part of a community, like, for example, if it was true that these women in the early church felt like they were just eking by, and at any moment the disciples were going to kick them out, or Paul was going to kick them out, like they weren't really a part of Christian leadership, they would not be fighting. They would not let any other people know that they're fighting. If you have ever been dating someone and you have met in-laws or people who you think might be future in-laws, you typically do not fight in front of them for fear that they will kick you out of the club, or they'll decide that you shouldn't be around. And if you've been in a romantic relationship long enough to get to a place where no matter how the fight goes, the person across from you is going to love you anyway, and you're not going to break up, that is a beautiful and lovely feeling. And so what I lift up as someone who has known kind of being on the margins is the beauty that can happen by being taken seriously enough that people want to resolve your argument. Right? It's one thing to just ignore you when you're mad about something. It's another thing to just kick you out of the group because you're arguing. But this is an example where Paul cares enough about what these 2 women are fighting about to say, we want to help them work it out. We want you to provide them with support. And there's no mention of kicking these women out. And so I really like that it means that they are not just begrudgingly a part of the group. They're not prostitutes who are reformed sinners, which a lot of the women in the Bible get translated into by later culture. These are a group of women who are not only they're not only important, but their concerns are important. And so that's what I wanted to lift up. Now, Amanda, be excited.
Okay, so it's not the scripture, which I'm sure you will find down here, is a great passage, and actually one I've used for several funerals, continuing that little bit of a theme. I've also used this for weddings. It's just a fantastic passage. The section Megan was referring to are verses 2 and 3, where we hear this call to Euodia and Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord, to find a way to resolve their conflict and to find reconciliation. The way that we know that those individuals are women is the next verse. I ask you also, my loyal companion, help these women. So that's how we know that these are women that are being addressed. There's some really interesting conversation we could have about the historical situation of the first 100 years of the church and the first, 50 years during the time of Paul. But the part of this text that really calls to me and that I use personally in my own life are the verses 4 through 9. And this whole section um, of trying to remain positive and trying to look to God, to find peace that surpasses understanding, and to stay focused on whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable. There's any excellence in anything worthy of praise, to think on these things. So one of the commentaries that were shared this morning talked about this is not just a call to being a Pollyanna. And I think that might be the easiest way for me to enter into this conversation a little bit, is to say that this isn't, Pollyanna can be used as an insult to people. Oh, you're just Pollyanna. You just look at the positive in everything. You don't actually ever see the reality of the world. You don't see the darkness in the world. You're just naive. And that is something that people who hold this verse close to their heart can easily be accused of. I shared with my pericope group this morning, and I will share with the world. My mother is perhaps the most Pollyanna person I have ever known in my life. Someone will cut you off in the car, and my mom will say, "Oh, they're probably rushing to help someone who's in need right now." Right? I mean, she just is the ultimate Pollyanna, and it drove me up the wall when I was a kid. I just wanted her to get angry at somebody, or to think poorly of somebody, or to judge somebody, or to not think the best about somebody, because I just couldn't handle that she all she could see were the possible ways in which these people were good people. And now, as my own adult, I stand accused of being very much like my mother. And I don't think that's a bad thing. It can set you up. I think that this call to this part of Christianity, this call to give your worries and your cares to God, this call to focus on the positive in everything and everyone that you see, this call to stay focused on the good, to focus on abundance, to look at abundance rather than scarcity. The call to live this part of our Christian faith can get you in a lot of trouble in our culture. It can set you up to be the recipient of abuse. It can set you up to be taken advantage of. It can set you up for all sorts of things. But this passage isn't just calling you to be a Pollyanna. This passage is calling you to remain hopeful. To focus on whatever is true and honorable and just does not mean that you are not going to get angry. It means that you will focus on what is true and honorable and just. And if those things make you angry and cause you to take action to bring God's justice into the world, that is still living this Christian life. We are not being called to be doormats, to excuse, forgive, and forget everything that people do. We're actually called to deep accountability with one another and deep accountability with other people. And we are called to find ways to forgive them and live in that tension of accountability and forgiveness, focusing on the positive in someone and not stop and continuing to create the kingdom of God on earth. And so it's this really hard tension to balance and to live, but this passage of calling us to choose to rejoice, to choose to be gentle in our world, to choose to look to the positives. It's hard. It's really, really, really hard work. And it brings a peace that passes understanding. Not an easy peace and not a simple peace. But it is a peace that comes from God. And as someone who was outside of the church and looked at people and watched them and thought, they have something that I don't have, and I want that. I don't know what it is that they have, but they have something, and I don't have that. And what is it? You know, I think for in my experience, I think that what I wanted was that peace that passes understanding. That end of the day, I do not understand these things, and our world is really screwed up sometimes, and people can make you angry, and they can do things that are atrocious and awful, and I don't get it, and I don't like it. But if I stay focused on those things, I am going to become that which I do not like. And so I will choose to focus on the good, and I will choose to focus on the honorable, and I will choose to focus on the commendable. I will choose to watch My Little Ponies and see beautiful things at the end of the day, because that way my heart is not hardened, and I can go back into the world with a peace that passes understanding and continue to love. So that's my homily. John, next. I pass the ball.
Well, I really love everything you just said. We actually spent a good chunk of time on the Philippians text in our study this week, too. I've clued in the parishioners that come to the study that Paul's letters are actually a coding system for pastors to rate their churches. I said, you know, so if you have a beloved pastor and he or she ever says, you know, they were my Philippians, it was awesome. On the other hand, if they ever say, yeah, they were my Corinthians, oh boy. Okay, disaster. But three things that really strike me in the text. One, thinking about that peace. I can't help read that text and not think about my father. In 2008, when he was dying of lymphoma, there would be these times where everyone in the medical staff was just freaking out around him in the room because nothing was going well. And I just remember him looking at us again and again and saying, they don't really understand because it's going to be okay. And he would just say that. And he wasn't saying it to them because he knew that he couldn't calm the nurses and everybody down, but he was saying it to us. And so that to me was kind of a witness of that experience of that peace that comes from knowing Christ. As far as the fight or the argument, whatever we don't really know what the argument is between Euodia and Syntyche, I kind of see almost a triple echo in this letter. And so we got the first echo, it was either, I think it might have just been even this last week, the Christ hymn, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ, right? And I see that's kind of an instruction for the whole community. It echoes in this passage with just the church leaders, right? Uh-oh, the church leaders are fighting. Y'all stop, please, and find out a way to do that. We even had a good laugh when we read about the loyal companion, because that person's not named, and I had reflected how some of the commentators think it's Timothy who's bringing the letter, some think it's one of the house leaders inside the church, but this poor person probably got to that line, maybe even without reading ahead, and so they know there's a fight. It's an important fight because it's between people who are really important to the life of that congregation, so if they don't resolve that, it has bad effect on the whole community. And this poor person that's reading the letter goes, oh yeah, and you, make sure you help them sort this out. I wouldn't want to be that person. But then the last echo I see is actually the exhortations that Amanda was talking about. It's that same idea one more time. So I see all of them as communal. The Christ as a communal admonition. The request to help the women sort out their fight is a communal admonition. And then even the emphasis on this excellence in communication, I see as a communal admonition. It's not just that we should individually sort of sit in our prayer rooms and think excellent thoughts, though that can be helpful, in terms of seeking inspiration. But I think in a bigger way, in this community where the apostle has so much love for them and they have love for him and apparently a lot of love for each other, is to keep the excellence in your conversation with each other going, because that's how you're going to discover where God needs you to go next. That's how you're going to discover what God is doing in this community, and it's also how you're going to figure out how to solve it when people who are vital to the life of the church disagree. This is going to happen. And so that quality of conversation is something that really helps move them forward.
I like that. And now for something completely different. The Matthew text is a lot like the Isaiah text in that it ends unfortunately. It's a parable of a king who decides to have a wedding feast, and those who are invited do not show up, and so the slaves are sent out to make kind of these people come, but they mistreat the slaves. Then the king gets mad. Then he sends out people to kill the killers and burns down the city, and then decides to just invite anyone who can be found to come to this wedding, good and bad, the text says, to bring them to the wedding. And where it seems like it's a parable of God being more compassionate and just and able to have this benevolent attitude, way better than all of us, and then goes into this weird place of this one guy comes and he doesn't wear the right outfit, and so he's gonna get thrown into the Gehenna with weeping and gnashing of teeth and be destroyed. And it ends with this text that is very fun to preach. Many are called, but few are chosen. Wah, wah, right? So this could be a really exciting text if you are someone who has a worldview or has noticed that people who have a lot of wealth and excess and power sometimes take advantage of that and don't show up. If you've ever invited your local political leader and they just decide not to show up even though they've told you they would, you might know kind of the pain and heartbreak of this kind of situation. And particularly these people not only are party flakes, but they're also jerks. They are inappropriate to the slaves and need to kind of be called out for that. If we think about the abominable ways that slave owners handled slaves here in this country, you might think, yay, we have a punishment for that, and this divine ruler kind of takes care of people who are horrible to slaves. Well, it's not really that text either. That would be a great text if that was what was happening here, because our divine leader has slaves too, right? So this is a very complicated text. It's one, as a pastor, that I would like to tap dance around and pretend that it doesn't exist, and I like to be honest when I would rather cross off the text as if I was the FBI with big black marker and not read parts of it. If the text could end before the line about many are called and few are chosen, that would be awesome. In particularly because that was a line that was used for me when the church was in a place when it wasn't yet ready to allow gay and lesbian pastors to serve. Very often, people would be like, many are called, but few are chosen. Ha! Well, can you imagine... you probably can't imagine. This happens sometimes. Can you imagine if someone came to the choir and, you know, you could tell which person this one is because they didn't blend in. They sang in whatever way they wanted to, and you went to them and they said, many are called to sing, but few are chosen, right? Many congregations have tryouts just for this very reason. Or what if there was someone who was really excited to be on the church council, and the pastor said right to their face, many are called, but few are chosen, right? This is probably a little bit more blunt than most of us would speak. And when God says this to people we don't like, it's awesome, right? But when someone says that God is saying it to us, it's the worstest, stupidest text on the planet. And as Lutherans, we have a theology that believes that regardless of how much you schmuck it up in your life, that via your baptism and via this reconciliation that Jesus did for us 2,000 years ago, right? If the thing that reconciles you to God happened 2,000 years ago through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, there's no way 2,000 years in the future I can screw that up. That's kind of the Lutheran understanding. Well, what the heck do we do? With many are called, few are chosen. Many of my least favorite things I've ever had to study in seminary are tied around this text. There's this idea of predestination that people argue about. It's this wondering if God is the smartest thing in the world, and God knows what the future's going to be before it happens, and God knows who's going to choose to be in relationship with God and who's not going to choose to be in relationship with God, then did God make the people to do that? Well, maybe. Well, if God's perfect, then this must be a part of God's perfect plan. And so if there are some people who are cast out and some people who are not cast out, then God is the caster-outer who created the world to roll that way. And some theologians, Calvin, right, have arguments within their texts back in a time when it was culturally appropriate to do so, where they argue, this baby dies and this baby dies. This baby goes to heaven because God does not want this baby to go to heaven because they are preordained to go to not heaven places. Bleh, I barf on that theology and I throw it in the dung pile. Moabite theology, right? And yet, it's still in our scripture, right? So this is one of those moments where probably most Lutheran pastors are going to tap dance around this text, and they're going to tell you why it doesn't really mean that, and or even just not put it in the bulletin, or preach about Philippians instead, and not kind of grapple with this idea that many are called, but few are chosen. That's what I'm going to do, probably, but I think this is hooey, and I just want you to know that you can be a faithful person, you can be a pastor, you can be a great Christian. You can pray every day and have fancy icons in your office and still think verses of the Bible are the dumbest thing you ever read in your entire life. What do you think, John?
Oh, yeah. This text was next to impossible earlier this afternoon. Even with the violence of going after the people who hurt the slaves, people were basically okay if we could cut the story off with everybody gets to go to the party, because that feels very, very gracious, and we just kind of overlook the slaughter part. But the poor guy who, someone said, in New York City, some restaurants require you to have certain clothing on, and they have jackets and ties at the maitre d' station. They will give you a jacket and a tie so that you're correctly dressed to go into the restaurant. And yet somehow this guy ends up at the party, the only one with the wrong outfit on. It makes you wonder what he was wearing. So people really just, they were really grinding against that part of the text especially. The idea that somehow you could be in orbit with God and then ejected later. It's a hard one. For me, just like last week's thing with the vineyard was really hard. I tried to keep in mind in reading this text where Jesus is and who's listening, right? So this is the continuation of that, hey, I just trashed the temple, and let me tell you one more story about how you haven't taken good care of God's people, right? And he knows that those people who have everything to gain from no change are listening, and there's also people listening who would really like some change. And so trying to keep that tension in mind that, Jesus is someone being conscious of his audience when he's telling this parable. But, in terms of theology, I don't know what to do with it, grace-wise. I'm probably going to aim for Philippians.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not even printing this gospel passage this week. I opted, this will be our last Sunday in Creation Tide here at Central, and so this is, during this season, I have been choosing to just print the text upon which I was going to preach, and knowing this gospel would be very, very difficult to preach and tie into creation care and ecology and giving thanks for our earth and our world. I stuck with the Philippians, and we won't be reading this because I don't feel like you can read "There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called but few are chosen," and then not address it as a pastor. I don't think you can put those words out. It's like when we read the passages about divorce or adultery or any of the others. I don't think we can read those in our Sunday morning worship space and then not address it. I just think it's irresponsible. So I'm not reading it, frankly, but there were some interesting things that came from text study this morning. There was a reference to some work by authors Molina and Rohrbaugh, are their last name. I don't know whether or not we'll be able to find anything to link down here, so I'm just going to reference this, and we may or may not be able to find information for you. But the comments that were interesting and took us to a point in the conversation where we could go somewhere with this gentleman at the end were the king would have had proper garments ready for the non-elites coming to the banquet. So like the New York restaurants with jackets and ties, right? Yet the king spots a person who does not put on the garments provided, thus shaming the king. The result, predictably, is the improperly garbed man is shamed by being thrown out by the attendants. So this commentary is talking a lot about the ways in which shame is being done back and forth here in lots of different ways based upon the culture of the time that Matthew is writing about. There's also some kind of bigger conversation about what Matthew might be referencing in this from Matthew's time period, which is later than the time period of Jesus. When this event, was being talked about, and the culture in which was being talked about is one time period, and then Matthew comes along many decades later and is writing about things. So we talked about in our group kind of the absurdity of the king being able to sack the city and burn it, which would have been his city, but okay. So just kind of, but the dinner is still fine. The dinner is still prepared. The oxen and fat calves are slaughtered. Everything's ready. Meanwhile, I'm going to go sack the city, but everything is still ready to so come to the party all at the same time. So chances are that this is not an actual literal event, that perhaps this is just a reference to kind of this over-the-top reaction to things. Perhaps it could be a reference to destruction of the temple, which Matthew is living after the temple has been destroyed in the year 70. And then there's this whole piece of this individual who is offered a robe and chooses not to wear it. And I think that there is some really hard stuff to talk about there that we, especially for Lutherans, because we are so grace-based and we are so kind of loose with our grace in a way, where we kind of throw it everywhere on everybody, whether they really want it or not. So it's hard when we talk about things like free will and that people can choose not to put on the cloak. People can choose to not accept help. People can choose to not accept grace. And that's really, really, really hard to believe, that someone could be faced with the love of God and choose not to accept it. And this is the case, that perhaps one way we can look at this text and find our way to dance around it, as a Lutheran pastor might, is to say that here is someone who is choosing not to accept God's grace. Does that mean that this person, we can take our theology and say, does this mean this person will always be where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth? Or does this mean that for now, this person's not going to get to enjoy the banquet because they're choosing not to participate in the banquet? But that doesn't mean that the banquet is over, and it doesn't mean that if he didn't go put the robe on, that he couldn't come back in and be a part of the feast. So I'm prancing around it. This is an example of how a Lutheran pastor might prance around it. And the other thing that was of note to our group this morning, Dr. David Lose is a very respected current modern theologian. Many, many pastors read Dr. Lose's words to prepare themselves for Sunday morning preaching. And in his partner in preaching this week, Dr. Lowe's talks about the historical context and talks about all these different pieces for us to understand. And at the end, Dr. Lowe's says, and really, it's probably easier to preach on Psalm 23. So go preach on Psalm 23. Good luck, everybody. So even Dr. Lowe's, who normally, as a colleague said this morning, is a roll up your shirt sleeves and dig into the gospel because this is what we're called to do. Even Dr. Lowe's is saying, yeah, if you skip to something else this week, it would be totally okay. So don't be surprised if many, many, many pastors across the United States choose to preach on Philippians or the Psalm this week as opposed to this very, very difficult and hard gospel passage.
I'll probably preach on it because I'm a sucker like that. But one thing that I think is interesting is when I think of what the equivalent would be of this, we don't really have a modern day equivalent because any comparison that we would have to people who are slaves would be a bad comparison because slavery is its own thing. But imagine if a king, or imagine that it was the sheriff, right? The sheriff is throwing a party and none of the politicians and none of the other police officers and the mayor don't want to come. And so the sheriff decides to invite all of the homeless people, good and bad homeless people. And imagine what that would feel like to go to the sheriff's party. It would feel like a trick, right? If you are someone who is a thief or someone who hasn't paid their taxes, going to the king's court might be a deadly thing to do. And so this is a risky, it implies a lot of trust and faith on both sides. The fact that anyone would show up to this party, if they are lower class, is going to be a huge detriment. And one of the things that I delighted in is that one of my members who often cannot hear Bible study and just says things out loud when he notices no one's lips are moving, was like right on point today and noticed, he said, look at this. All the good and all of the bad showed up. That's like a lot of people, right? A lot of bad people showed up and only one person got in trouble. You would expect a lot of people to get in trouble. So if what this means, this was his Lutheran solution, right? Because we want everybody to feel like they can be reconciled to God. But his joy was that when he had first read it, he thought a bunch of people were going to get in trouble, and just one did. Just one guy who didn't put on the robe. As long as that one guy isn't us, then all right, maybe it's a great text. The other thing that this reminds me of is starting on Monday, I'll be beginning my first section of my trip around the world to see all of the wonders of the world and to think about God's wonders. And so I'll be in touch with Amanda and some of our other pastor visitors about how we're going to do Bible study that doesn't suck, how we'll keep that going. If I'm going to have internet access or not, we'll find out kind of as we go on that trip. But what I've been thinking about is one of our flights got changed for our second leg of the trip that's kind of all across the world, starting in Beijing and ending in London. And our trip now has a layover of about 11 hours in Saudi Arabia. What that means is that my legal marriage to my wife Laurel, which is documented on our passports, and where we will need to get a visa in a country where it's illegal and punishable by death, is something that we have to think about as we travel through this space. And so there are places and there are situations where if you come to the party, you can get in big trouble. The other requirement, as I was reading through the State Department's list of things you need to know about traveling through Saudi Arabia, is that women are expected to wear full coverings. And as a trans person who identifies as kind of in the middle space between male and female, I've had to think about this for a long time in my journey. What kinds of clothing would I wear at places like the Wailing Wall, where it means this entrance for women and this entrance for men? Do I pick what my passport says? Do I pick what my heart says? Do I pick what my baptismal certificate says? How do I decide what I'm going to wear? and how I'm going to enter these gendered spaces, and particularly where it can mean life or death, or being put in jail, or expelled from a country. And in Saudi Arabia, if you are a woman and you've chosen to wear the garments, you can't enter the country without a male escort. So what does it mean for these choices? What does it mean for our identification? There are places where if women don't dress a certain way, they will be killed. I'll put a link down here of some of the work. I think it's a woman named Malia who's been advocating for women getting education and was shot in the head. But there are places where choosing to wear an outfit or not wear an outfit is a matter of life and death, and people pick differently depending upon their power and their privilege and their desire to make a statement, or maybe to move history forward in a direction that they think might be kinder and more compassionate. I'm not saying that dressing a certain way. I think respecting faiths is very important. I think these are important internal decisions to make, but we do have experiences of where wearing the right outfit is a matter of life and death. And for some of our soldiers right now, when the military budget gets cut and they don't have the ability to wear all of the armor that could protect them, the ability for us to provide the kinds of clothing that could save someone's life is a matter of life and death. And so for most of us, whether or not we have the right high-heeled shoes is not as important as it was to Carrie Bradshaw in Sex and the City, right? For the most part, it's not life or death what we wear in our communities in the United States, but there's lots of people in other countries for whom what you wear is life and death, and for whom a parable like this might speak well beyond what we're understanding in terms of our political understandings. There are some people who are beginning to talk about how on the news everywhere, you might have noticed, people are talking about Ebola. Ebola! Don't worry, you can't get it through an online Bible study. But what people are talking about is that the countries where Ebola is present right now are the countries that were devastated because of the slave trade in the United States. It's some of the places where a lot of people were stolen from their families and taken on boats to the United States that had a devastating consequence on their culture, on their livelihood, and on their economies. And there are reasons that these countries have had difficulties rebuilding, and part of that is because of what the United States has done as a result of slavery and how we resolve that. There's no easy answer, right? There's no easy answer on how we make slavery okay, because I don't think you can make slavery okay. I don't think you can ever make up for or completely atone for. We can try to be better in the future, but what does it mean that there is an economic implication, and right now a very real health implication, to a large part of the world? So these are just some of the things that you could talk about in connection to this text. If you're brave enough to talk about slavery, if you're brave enough to talk about Ebola, particularly right before people swap spit for communion, right? If you're brave enough to talk about different standards of what kind of dress that people wear in other faiths, and controversial laws in other countries. So there's a lot definitely to chew on with this Matthew text, and it just kind of depends what you want to talk about. Does anyone have any other thoughts that haven't come up yet in this lectionary text that you want to make sure that we say before we go? I see Amanda's on the phone, so I'm going to ask you, John.
Yeah, I could almost see some value if to take this Matthew text, if I were doing a series out of the different uses of binding, because I noticed that they don't just chuck the guy out of the building, they bind him, right? And so the whole idea of being bound or tied up or untied, which is an interesting thing, you know, slaves, tied, untied, that goes all through Matthew, talking about sin and its consequences for the individual, its consequences for the community. So I mean, I wonder if there's something you could do with that if you were preaching on it in a series. And so, because I think it's just too much to unpack in one Sunday. Like, hey, here's what Matthew says about binding and loosing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Amanda, we're doing closing thoughts. If you have any closing thoughts about any of the text, do you have any?
Whatever is good, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable. Think on these things. No, beyond that, I mean, nope, not this week. It's hard stuff.
Yes. So say some prayers for your pastors this week. We might need some help with our preaching unless we've gone with Philippians. Well, thank you everyone for watching Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. We're glad to have you here. Don't forget to eat on a regular basis and get rest. We'll see you next time, or perhaps I won't because I might be in another country. Bye.